quiet, unassuming landscapes of Green Isle, Minnesota, a town that rarely made headlines. The sun set on June 14, 2025, like any other summer evening. The air was warm, the skies clear, and the neighborhoods were winding down into their nightly routines. While lurking somewhere in the shadows of that seemingly peaceful suburb, a darkness had taken form and unspeakable intent that would soon shatter the lives of some of Minnesota's most recognizable political figures. This wasn't just any crime. It was an execution, a carefully planned, cold-blooded operation aimed not at random civilians, but at the very heart of the state's political leadership. The brutality, the precision, and the sheer audacity of the act would leave not just Minnesota, but the entire nation stunned and scrambling for answers. Tonight, on Room 57, we delve deep into what the press has since dubbed the Minnesota Lawmaker Massacre. This is a story of calculated murder, political paranoia, and a chase that gripped America for 2 days straight, a grim reminder that even in the bastions of democracy, no one is truly safe from the reach of madness. It all began at dusk, when the home of Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark in Green Isle turned into the first crime scene. Melissa Hortman wasn't just any resident. She was a towering figure in Minnesota politics. The former Speaker of the Minnesota House of Representatives, a veteran lawmaker known for her poise, intelligence, and fierce advocacy. Mark, her devoted husband, was equally respected within the community. Their home, often a place of discussion, policy drafting, and quiet domestic life, became the site of horror. According to initial reports, neighbors heard multiple gunshots, a sequence so rapid and calculated that it was clear this was no mere robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. When first responders arrived, the scene was gruesome. Both Melissa and Mark were found dead on the spot, their bodies riddled with bullets. No valuables were taken. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had done this knew exactly who they were killing and had done so with lethal efficiency. Before investigators could even begin to process this first tragedy, a second report shattered the night. Another lawmaker, Senator John Hoffman, and his wife had been attacked in a similar fashion at their home. The couple was ambushed with a merciless barrage of bullets. In fact, autopsy and hospital records later confirmed that 17 bullets were fired at them, a terrifying number that spoke volumes about the killer's intent to leave no survivors. But fate intervened. Both John and his wife survived, albeit gravely wounded. They would later recount fragments of the attack, the shadowy figure, the rapid-fire shots, the feeling of impending death. Minnesota was officially under siege. To coordinated attacks on prominent politicians on the same night, it wasn't just a crime. It was a declaration of war against the state's leadership. The immediate question that surfaced: who could orchestrate such a precise and brutal mission, and why? Law enforcement agencies, from the local police to the FBI, jumped into action. The initial investigation revealed chilling details. The assailant had been disguised as a police officer, complete with a uniform and fake credentials. This disguise allowed him to approach his targets without suspicion, to knock on their doors and be let in, or at least get close enough to open fire before anyone could react. Such a calculated approach pointed to preparation and a deep understanding of the victim's routines. It was no spur-of-the-moment crime. This was an operation, and someone had meticulously planned every step. As news of the killing spread, public panic set in. Politicians in Minnesota canceled public appearances. Security details were tripled for prominent figures. Citizens locked their doors, suspicious of anyone in uniform. For the first time in decades, the political heart of Minnesota beat not with pride, but with fear. Meanwhile, police scoured CCTV footage, canvassed neighborhoods, and issued an all-points bulletin for a suspect matching the description of the fake officer. But the assailant had vanished into the night. That is, until the first major break in the case came from an unexpected clue. A local gas station attendant recalled seeing a man fitting the suspect's description buying fuel late at night, looking nervous and paying in cash. CCTV footage confirmed the sighting. The timestamp placed him in a trajectory leading south of the Twin Cities, toward the more rural stretches of Minnesota. A statewide manhunt was underway. Roadblocks went up. Every available resource was mobilized. But it wasn't until 2 days later that the manhunt bore fruit. On June 16, 2025, after a 2-day pursuit that had every law enforcement officer in the state on edge, authorities captured Vance Boelter, a 57-year-old Minnesotan, in the rural outskirts of Green Isle. When they approached him, Boelter was heavily armed, his vehicle containing an arsenal of weapons, ammunition, tactical gear, and most chilling of all, a list of nearly 70 names, all of them prominent politicians, judges, and public figures. Boelter didn't resist. In fact, he reportedly smiled as he was handcuffed, telling officers, "You're just delaying the mission." The revelation sent shockwaves through the country. A hit list, tactical gear, the guise of a law enforcement officer. Boelter wasn't Just a deranged loner, he was an assassin on a politically motivated mission. As police began piecing together his background, a portrait of a deeply disturbed man emerged. Vance Boelter had no prior criminal record of significance, but those who knew him described a man increasingly obsessed with politics, conspiracy theories, and extremist ideologies. He had isolated himself, consumed by dark narratives about the government, the political elite, and imagined plots against the American people. But nothing prepared investigators for what Boelter had sent the FBI just days before the murders. A handwritten letter, 9 pages long, had arrived at the FBI's Minneapolis office. In it, Boelter claimed he was acting on a sacred mission to cleanse the nation of corrupt and treasonous leaders. He accused Minnesota's governor, Tim Walz, of being a puppet in a larger conspiracy and alleged that many state politicians were participants in secret deals threatening American sovereignty. It was rambling, disconnected, filled with grandiose accusations and paranoid delusions. Yet it had a terrifying coherence when paired with the reality of the murders. Boelter wasn't just ranting, he was killing. As the investigation deepened, the FBI disclosed that the list found in his vehicle wasn't just a set of names, it was annotated. Next to some names were addresses, security details, daily routines. It was a blueprint for further assassinations had Boelter not been stopped. What made the entire situation more disturbing was the breadth of his intended targets. The list included Democrats, Republicans, independents. It was less about political affiliation and more about Boelter's internal, chaotic measure of who he deemed corrupt. America watched in horror. A targeted political massacre had been barely averted, but at a terrible cost to dead, to injured, and an entire political establishment shaken to its core. But the most chilling question remained: was Boelter acting alone, or was there a network backing him? The FBI launched a parallel investigation into Boelter's communications, finances, and associations, searching for co-conspirators or evidence of a larger extremist group. While no direct accomplices have been confirmed to date, authorities remain vigilant, especially given the rise in politically motivated violence across the United States. As Boelter awaited trial, the public and media speculated endlessly on his motivations, his psyche, and how a man could devolve from political observer to mass murderer. In interviews, former acquaintances described a gradual unraveling. What started as political frustration became fanaticism, then obsession, and finally lethal action. This was not just a crime, it was a warning, a harrowing illustration of how unchecked radicalization, access to firearms, and political paranoia can converge into real-world violence with devastating consequences. In the aftermath, security protocols for public officials across the U.S. were overhauled. Politicians spoke of the need for unity, but many did so behind newly reinforced barriers. Flanked by security details, a stark symbol of a democracy increasingly under siege from within. For Minnesota, the scars of that summer night in 2025 will not heal easily. The homes of Melissa Hortman and John Hoffman stand as grim reminders that in the face of extremism, even the walls of political power can be breached. And so the question echoes: how many more Vance Boelters are waiting in the shadows, preparing their own missions, fueled by hatred, conspiracy, and a distorted sense of purpose? In our next chapter, we'll explore Boelter's trial, the political aftermath, and the haunting legacy this case has left on Minnesota's political landscape. Part 2, Inside the Mind of a Killer, the dark descent of Vance Boelter. When Vance Boelter was finally captured on that June afternoon, the entire nation exhaled relieved that the manhunt was over, but chilled by the question that still echoed: who was this man, and what drove him to commit such calculated political assassinations? As investigators peeled back the layers of his life, what emerged was not a simple story of criminality or a fleeting act of madness. It was something far more sinister: a slow, creeping radicalization, a descent into paranoia, conspiracy, and a delusion of grandeur that led one man to believe that he was chosen to cleanse his state, perhaps even the nation, of political corruption. This is the story of that descent, a path paved with anger, isolation, and the dangerous allure of extremist ideology. Who was Vance Boelter? On paper, Boelter was an ordinary man. Born in 1968 in Minnesota, he had lived a relatively unremarkable life working various blue-collar jobs, never quite settling into a single career path. By all accounts, his early years were not marked by violence or criminal activity. He had no serious criminal record, no signs of overt hostility, no outbursts that would have flagged him as a future threat. But beneath the surface, the seeds of discontent had been quietly germinating. Those who knew Boelter described him as reclusive, highly opinionated, and increasingly distrustful of government institutions. He wasn't outwardly dangerous, but he carried an air of simmering resentment, a man perpetually convinced that the world was conspiring against him and others like him. Former acquaintances recalled how, over the past decade, Boelter had withdrawn further from social circles, spending more time alone, buried in online forums steeped in conspiracy theories. He subscribed to fringe narratives about government corruption, secret cabals, and shadowy forces manipulating world events. To Boelter, these weren't theories, they were facts, unacknowledged by the sheep around him. But the internet wasn't just feeding his paranoia, it was affirming it, giving him a community, however toxic, that echoed his darkest suspicions and radicalized him further. The letter to the FBI, a manifesto of madness, perhaps the clearest window into Boelter's psyche, came in the form of a handwritten, 9-page letter he sent to the FBI office in Minneapolis, just days before the attacks. This wasn't just a confession or a rant. It was a manifesto, a meticulously written document that sought to justify his upcoming actions. As a form of patriotic duty, in the letter, Boelter referred to himself not by name, but as the cleansing hand. He claimed he had been chosen by destiny to eradicate the plague of treachery infecting our political system. He wrote, "For too long, the corrupt have dictated the lives of good Americans. The time has come for retribution, not by the weak hands of politics, but by the strong arm of justice, of purification." The letter accused several Minnesota politicians by name of being agents in a globalist conspiracy aimed at eroding American sovereignty, facilitating foreign influence, and betraying the real Americans. Among the names he singled out were Governor Tim Walz, Amy Klobuchar, and Tina Smith. Former Speaker Melissa Hort Manson, John Hoffman. Boelter claimed that these leaders were not merely corrupt, but were traitors deserving death. The language was chillingly formal, methodical, and devoid of any empathy. There was no remorse, no hesitation, only conviction. The hit list, a blueprint of violence. When authorities searched Boelter's vehicle, they discovered more than just firearms and tactical gear. They found a detailed hit list containing nearly 70 names of politicians, judges, journalists, and activists. This was no hastily scribbled collection of targets. It was organized, annotated with personal details, home addresses, known security measures, and daily routines. In some cases, Boelter had even sketched floor plans of his intended victims' homes, sourced through publicly available records or perhaps surveillance. Investigators realized with horror that the massacre could have been far worse. Melissa, Hortman, and John Hoffman were the beginning, not the culmination. Had Boelter not been caught, there could have been a systematic elimination of Minnesota's political leadership. FBI analysts described the list as an assassination ledger, comparable to the worst political purges in history. This revelation shifted the nature of the investigation. What law enforcement faced wasn't just a murder, it was someone enacting a personal jihad against the democratic process itself. A psyche consumed by delusional psychological experts brought in to assess Boelter painted a disturbing picture of his mind. One psychiatrist, under anonymity, described him as suffering from paranoid delusions, bordering on schizophrenia, but exacerbated by years of social isolation and online radicalization. However, Boelter was not deemed legally insane. He was fully aware of his actions, planned them with precision, and could articulate his motives clearly. His was a case where mental illness and political extremism intersected dangerously, producing a man who believed his fantasy so deeply that he acted on it. In his interrogations, Boelter remained defiant. He referred to his actions as Phase 1 and insisted that the mission was not yet over. When pressed on whether he had accomplices, Boelter was coy, often smiling or responding cryptically, "You'll see, others are watching. They know what to do." To date, no evidence has surfaced confirming additional conspirators, but the possibility continues to haunt investigators and political leaders alike. The path to radicalization, a cautionary tale. How does a man like Vance Boelter come to believe that murder is justified, even necessary? Experts on radicalization point to a perfect storm of factors: economic instability. Boelter had struggled financially for years, fostering resentment, social isolation, divorced, estranged from family, with few friends left, online echo chambers, spending years on extremist forums that validated his worldview, conspiracy theories, a steady diet of misinformation about government, globalism, and cultural shifts that he perceived as threats. This confluence created a psychological feedback loop where every problem, personal, societal, or political, had a singular cause: corrupt leadership, which in his mind warranted execution. It is a chilling reminder of how vulnerable individuals can be groomed into extremism, especially in an age where the internet can serve as both radicalizer and recruiter. Public and political reaction news of Boelter's manifesto and the hit list sent shockwaves through Minnesota and the broader political landscape. Governor Tim Walz, one of Boelter's stated targets, delivered a somber press conference. This was not just an attack on individuals. This was an attack on our democracy, on the rule of law, and on the principle that disputes are resolved at the ballot box, not through the barrel of a gun. Security for public officials across the state was immediately heightened. Many lawmakers, particularly those named in Boelter's documents, were placed under temporary protective custody. Public events were canceled or heavily guarded, but beyond security, the incident sparked a nationwide conversation about the growing threat of political violence in America. Analysts and commentators debated the role of social media in fostering extremism, the dangers of unchecked conspiracy narratives, and the urgent need for mental health interventions. The man behind bars. But the ideology persists while Boelter awaited trial. His actions inspired both fear and fascination. There were reports of fringe groups online hailing him as a patriot, a martyr for the truth, even though his mission was interrupted. This aspect of the case has deeply troubled law enforcement. The fear isn't just about Boelter himself, but the copycat potential his case represents. When an individual crosses the line from radical beliefs to action, it can embolden others watching from the shadows. To mitigate this, the FBI launched further initiatives to monitor extremist chatter online, especially in Minnesota and neighboring states. Lingering questions to this day. Several questions remain unanswered. Did Boelter have silent enablers or sympathizers helping him? Were any of the names on his list where they were being stalked? Could law enforcement have intercepted Boelter earlier? Had warning signs been identified? The tragedy exposed glaring gaps in the tracking of domestic extremist individuals who may have no prior criminal records but harbor deadly intentions. Coming up next in our next episode, we'll take you inside the courtroom where Boelter faced his reckoning, the trial that would determine whether he would live the rest of his life behind bars or face the ultimate penalty. We'll explore the prosecution's case, the defense's controversial arguments about mental illness and political persecution, and the testimonies that brought the courtroom to tears. Stay with us on Room 57 as we continue unraveling one of the darkest political crime sprees in recent American history. Part 3, the trial of Vance Boelter. Justice in the shadow of Firth Courtroom was packed on the morning of October 20th, 2025, when Vance Boelter was brought before the bench for the first day of his highly anticipated trial. Outside, reporters clustered shoulder to shoulder, cameras rolling, broadcasting live to a nation still reeling from the brutality of his crimes. The citizens of Minnesota, along with much of America, waited to see whether justice could truly be served for a man who had not just committed murder, but who had also struck a symbolic blow against the heart of democracy. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with tension. Survivors, family members of the victims, and high-ranking officials sat together, many under the watchful eyes of armed security guards. Everyone present knew that this trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a confrontation with a growing darkness and ideology that had found its most dangerous expression in Boelter's actions. The prosecution's opening. The prosecution wasted no time setting the tone. In their opening statements, they described Boelter not just as a killer, but as an ideologue driven by hate, paranoia, and a personal mission to execute his warped sense of justice. The lead prosecutor, Eleanor Worth, addressed the jury directly. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not a crime of passion, not an accident, not even the desperate act of a mentally disturbed individual. This was a cold, calculated, and methodically executed plan to assassinate the leaders of our state, planned over months, if not years. Worth outlined the evidence that would unfold. The detailed hit list found at Boelter's vehicle, the cache of weapons, including modified firearms designed for maximum lethality, surveillance footage placing him near the victim's homestays. Before the attacks, the manifesto sent to the FBI, outlining his cleansing mission. To drive the point home, Worth concluded, Vance Boelter appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner, but in this courtroom, he will face the one form of justice he denied his victims, the due process of law. The defense's controversial strategy. Boelter's defense attorney, Michael Garrett, took a far different approach, one that immediately stirred controversy. Garrett argued that while the facts of the killings were undeniable, the mental state of his client was central to the case. Mr. Boelter suffers from severe delusions, fueled by untreated mental illness and years of isolation. Garrett asserted he lives in a world that does not exist, ruled by enemies he invented, carrying out orders he believed were given to him by a higher power. Garrett aimed to establish a diminished capacity defense, asserting that Boelter could not fully grasp the wrongfulness of his actions due to his mental condition. To support this, the defense planned to call a series of psychiatric experts, as well as former acquaintances who would describe Boelter's growing detachment from reality over the years. But the mere mention of mental illness triggered public outrage. Survivors, family members, and much of the public saw this as an attempt to excuse the inexcusable, to humanize a man who had shown no remorse, who had murdered in cold blood. The prosecution's case, methodical and merciless. Over the following weeks, the prosecution laid out a devastatingly thorough case. Ballistics experts testified that the bullets recovered from the victims matched weapons found in Boelter's possession. Digital forensic analysts revealed that Boelter had spent months researching his targets online, tracking their movements, security patterns, and personal routines. A forensic psychiatrist presented the chilling observation that Boelter's writings in his manifesto and private journals were organized, deliberate, and goal-oriented, not the product of a chaotic mind. But perhaps the most harrowing testimony came from Senator John Hoffman, one of the survivors. He recounted, his voice trembling, "The night of the attack, we heard a knock. I thought it was the police, so I opened the door without hesitation. Then came the shots, one after another, without pause. I remember my wife screaming, then silence. I thought we were both going to die." Hoffman paused before continuing. "What strikes me most is the coldness in his eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He was precise, like he was fulfilling an obligation. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The gravity of Boelter's crimes was no longer abstract. It was real, embodied in the wounded presence of Hoffman and the absence of Melissa and Mark Hortman. The defense's argument, a mind consumed by madness when the defense took their turn. They painted a picture of a man spiraling into delusion. They brought in Dr. Evelyn Carver, a renowned forensic psychiatrist, who evaluated Boelter over several weeks. Dr. Carver testified, "Mr. Boelter exhibits clear signs of paranoid schizophrenia, compounded by delusional disorder. His belief system is so entrenched that he genuinely perceives his actions as necessary for the nation's survival." She cited his writings, not only the manifesto, but his private journals, where Boelter spoke of being chosen by a cosmic force to strike the first blow in the Second American Revolution. Friends and former co-workers also testified. They described a man who, over the years, had become obsessed with online conspiracy communities, spending days without leaving his home, refusing to interact socially, and ranting about shadow governments and globalist puppets. One former friend said, "He was never violent when I knew him, but he talked a lot about how the world was rigged, that politicians were in on some massive betrayal. I think, in his head, he was already at war." The turning point. The journal entries what ultimately tilted the scales came not from testimony, but from Boelter's own hand. Among the evidence were journals Boelter kept, meticulously documenting his plans. These weren't the ravings of a madman, but calculated strategist entries detailing what weapons to use, how to disguise himself, which routes to take to avoid detection. One entry, dated March 12, 2025, read, "Eliminate primary targets first. Ensure no loose ends. Disguises to aid access police uniform most effective. Avoid electronic trails. Mission must proceed in phases." Another entry, disturbingly methodical, listed rehearsal days, times when Boelter scoped out his victims' homes to memorize surroundings. For the jury, this was damning. This wasn't the work of someone disconnected from reality, but of someone painfully aware of every detail, driven by ideology rather than insanity. Public outcry and media frenzy as the trial progressed. The case dominated headlines. News networks debated endlessly, was Boelter insane or simply evil? Was America doing enough to combat radicalization? Were politicians becoming legitimate targets in an increasingly hostile political climate? Public opinion was divided, but among survivors and the political community, the sentiment was clear. Boelter must face the full weight of the law. The verdict after nearly 5 weeks of testimony. The jury deliberated for just 3 days. On November 24, 2025, the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple firearms violations. Boelter showed no emotion as the verdict was delivered. He stared straight ahead, unflinching in a post-verdict press conference. Prosecutor Eleanor Worth declared, "Justice has been served today, not just for the victims and their families, but for the principle that no ideology, no delusion, no manifesto gives a person the right to take lives. Sentencing, life or death?" During the sentencing phase, the debate reignited. Should Boelter receive the death penalty, or should he be imprisoned for life without parole? After extensive consideration, and in part due to Minnesota's complex legal stance on capital punishment, Boelter was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For some, it wasn't enough. For others, it was fitting that he should live out his days in a cell, alone with the echo of his own mind. Reflections on the nation's wounds. Boelter trial closed a dark chapter, but the wounds remain. Politicians continue to live under heightened security. Minnesota, once seen as a model of civility in politics, now grapples with a lingering shadow. More troubling, however, is the broader question, was Boelter an anomaly, or a symptom of a deeper sickness? That question remains unanswered, hanging over America like a storm cloud. Part 4. After the gunfire. The political fallout and America's reckoning echoes of Vance Boelter's rampage did not fade with his sentencing, though the court had sealed his fate. The bullets he fired continued to reverberate through Minnesota and across the United States. The political class, the media, and ordinary citizens were left grappling with an unsettling question. What does it mean when political violence reemerges within a democracy? And how does a society move forward after such a direct assault on its leaders? This wasn't just a series of murders. It was a symbolic rupture, a challenge to the very foundations of civil discourse and the safety of public service. And as the dust settled, America was forced to confront truths it had long tried to ignore. The immediate political fallout in the days following Boelter's conviction. Minnesota's political landscape was marked by an unprecedented atmosphere of vulnerability. Elected officials, who once walked freely among their constituents, began appearing in public accompanied by visibly armed security details. Town hall meetings were postponed or moved to virtual formats. Legislative sessions in St. Paul commenced under the watchful eyes of an increased police presence. Snipers positioned on rooftops and checkpoints controlling access to government buildings. Governor Tim Walz addressed the state in a somber televised statement. We must not allow terror, whether foreign or domestic, to dictate the terms of our democracy, but we must also be vigilant, because the danger is no longer hypothetical. It walked among us. It knocked on our doors. The psychological impact on Minnesota lawmakers was profound. Some confessed privately to contemplating resignation, fearing for their family's safety. For the first time in decades, a sitting state government publicly discussed the establishment of permanent personal security details for high-profile officials. At the federal level, Congress convened emergency hearings to address the rising threat of domestic political extremism. The Department of Homeland Security issued updated threat assessments, explicitly naming anti-government extremists, radicalized lone actors, and online conspiracy networks as growing dangers. Policy reforms and the debate on security in response to the massacre. Minnesota quickly passed the Political Violence Prevention Act of 2026, a bipartisan initiative that allocated funding for increased security for all state lawmakers, created a specialized intelligence unit to monitor threats against public officials, instituted mandatory threat assessment training for local police and sheriff departments. But these moves weren't without controversy. Civil liberties groups raised concerns about privacy, government surveillance, and the potential for these measures to be misused against legitimate political dissenters. At the national level, the Boelter case reignited the perennial debate over gun control. Activists pointed to the ease with which Boelter amassed his arsenal, including high-capacity magazines and body armor, all obtained legally under Minnesota's permissive gun laws. Senator Amy Klobuchar, who was herself on Boelter's hit list, gave an impassioned speech on the Senate floor. How many more times must we gather in mourning before we gather in action? This is not just about guns, it's about the ideological pipelines that fuel killers and the tools that make their fantasies deadly reality. Yet, as with so many gun control efforts in America, the proposal soon hit a wall of partisan resistance. The familiar stalemate returned, with Republicans arguing that mental health interventions were more urgently needed than new firearm restrictions. The rise of political extremism and online radicalization banned policy. There was an urgent cultural conversation about how online ecosystems incubate radical beliefs. Investigations into Boelter's digital footprint revealed his deep immersion in extremist forums, encrypted chat rooms, and social media channels dedicated to conspiracy theories like QAnon, anti-government militias, and apocalyptic nationalism. Platforms where dissent transformed into dehumanization, and where political opposition became a justification for execution. Boelter wasn't merely a madman. He was a product of the algorithmic rabbit holes that define the modern information age. Tech companies faced renewed scrutiny. Committees in both the House and Senate called executives from social media giants to testify about their efforts or lack thereof in curbing extremist content. Dr. Angela Myers, a counterterrorism expert, summarized the threat before Congress. We're witnessing the gamification of radicalization. Online communities reward escalating rhetoric, conspiratorial thinking, and even plans for violence. The line between fantasy and action has eroded. As a result, new regulatory proposals were floated, including legislation to hold platforms legally accountable for hosting extremist content, a digital parallel to the reforms imposed on traditional publishers. The climate of fear and the changing face of public service. Perhaps one of the most tragic consequences of the Boelter massacre was its impact on the nature of public service itself. Political science studies conducted in 2026 found that 34% of state legislators nationwide reported receiving credible death threats within the past year. 22% of surveyed candidates reconsidered running for office due to personal safety concerns. The implication was clear. Democracy itself was at risk of being hollowed out by fear. where only those willing to brave the threat of violence would dare to participate. In Minnesota, efforts were made to humanize politicians, again, to bridge the widening gap between lawmakers and citizens. Town halls resumed, albeit with security checkpoints, and public schools introduced civic education programs emphasizing nonviolence and democratic engagement. Yet the specter of Boelter's actions lingered. Every knock at the door, every unexpected visitor, was a reminder that the unthinkable had already happened. Global reflections and international parallels. Massacre didn't just resonate within the United States. Across the world, observers drew parallels between Boelter's ideology and other instances of politically motivated violence. The 2011 assassination attempt on U.S. Representative Gabrielle Giffords, the 2016 murder of British MP Joe Cox by a far-right extremist, the attack on Brazil's governmental institutions in 2023 by radicalized supporters of former President Bolsonaro. Scholars began referring to the Boelter case as part of a global pattern of anti-democratic violence, where political frustration, fueled by disinformation and tribalism, erupts into bloodshed. International security forums and democracies worldwide took heed, sharing intelligence on radicalization pathways, digital extremism, and best practices for safeguarding elected officials. A nation's reckoning, lessons unlearned. Despite the intense focus in the aftermath, critics argued that America was once again sleepwalking past its warning signs. Dr. Lee Sanford, a political historian, warned Boelter was a symptom, not a singular aberration. If we failed to address the conditions that allowed him to thrive, the disinformation, the polarization, the glorification of violence, then we are simply awaiting the next name, the next manifesto, the next massacre. By late 2026, there was evidence that online chatter in extremist circles had not decreased, but merely adapted, moving to more encrypted platforms, becoming harder to trace. Some even hailed Boelter as a fallen warrior, a martyr in their imagined war. Law enforcement agencies ramped up counter-extremism efforts, but the challenge remained vast. Unlike foreign terrorist networks, domestic threats blend seamlessly into American life, their radicalization process hidden behind screens and closed doors. The legacy of the victims for the families of Melissa and Mark Hortman, the Wound, remains personal, not political. In a public statement, their daughter, Elise Hortman, spoke at a memorial. My parents dedicated their lives to making Minnesota better, safer, more just. They were not symbols, they were people, parents, grandparents. Their murder is a permanent scar on this state, but I refuse to let their lives be overshadowed by one man's hatred. In their honor, the Hortman Foundation for Civic Unity was established, promoting initiatives to increase public safety for civic leaders, educate communities on the dangers of political extremism, foster dialogue across political divides. Their legacy became a testament to resilience in the face of terror, declaration that even in darkness, light persists. Where do we go from here? The aftermath of the Minnesota lawmaker massacre left America grappling with urgent questions. Can democracy survive in an era where political engagement is a life-threatening act? What responsibilities do tech platforms have in curbing digital radicalization? How do we balance security with openness in a democratic society? There are no easy answers, but the consensus was clear. Boelter may have been stopped, but the conditions that created him remain. As America continues to navigate this complex landscape, the hope is that vigilance, education, and policy reforms can stem the tide of extremism. But until then, every politician, every civic leader, carries the shadow of that night in June 2025, a night when democracy itself was held at gunpoint. In Part 5, we'll explore the broader legacy of the Boelter case, how it shaped future elections, changed public trust, and what it teaches us about the fragility of democratic institutions in the 21st century. Stay tuned, and thank you for watching Room 57, Part 5, The Lingering Legacy, Lessons, Shadows, and an Uncertain Future in the months and years following the horrific events of the Minnesota lawmaker massacre. The shadow of Vance Boelter did not dissipate. It simply changed form, shifting from the tangible fear of a gunman on the loose to an enduring unease that settled deep within the fabric of American democracy. Because the truth remained, even with Boelter behind bars, the threat he represented, the ideologies, the extremism, the culture of violence had not been vanquished. If anything, it had adapted, learned, and continued to fester beneath the surface of the nation's political discourse. Elections in the shadow of violence. As the 2026 and 2028 election cycles approached, the lingering effects of Boelter's crimes were undeniable. Politicians, particularly in Minnesota, campaigned under heightened security. Town halls, once the beating heart of direct democracy, became sterile and sanitized affairs, conducted behind metal detectors and bulletproof glass. Some candidates, especially women and minorities, chose not to run at all, citing credible death threats and concerns for their families' safety. For others, The massacre was a chilling reminder of the stakes involved in public service, redefining courage not as a political virtue, but as a survival necessity. This was a quiet, corrosive victory Boelter had unwittingly achieved. The psychological warfare he waged continued to shape who dared to lead in, who stayed silent. Shifts in policy and security culture were tangible policy shifts, particularly in Minnesota, which became a case study for legislative and security reform. Permanent security funding for state legislators, expanded roles for threat assessment teams, integrating social media monitoring with law enforcement. Federally, a new task force within the Department of Homeland Security was established to specifically address threats to elected officials. Yet, these measures came at a cost, an increasingly visible fortification of political spaces, making public servants less accessible, more isolated, and ironically, more detached from the people they represented. Critics argued that this was the death of grassroots politics, where the distance between leaders and citizens widened, not by choice, but by fear. Media and cultural reckoning's legacy of Boelter also forced a reckoning within the media and tech industries. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative reports dissected his path to radicalization, his online activities, and the digital communities that shaped his warped worldview.